Okay.
Professor,
Yes.
I think I was listening to the discussions. I was only muted, but I think it's quite a matter of interest that this particular session is being arranged here. And I also must express my gratitude for the appreciation that you are showing towards the issues of the Northeastern region and the people of the Northeastern region. I think when we talk about is it English is all right, sir, or Hindi?
Yes. Yes.
English is all right. So I saw Professor Jayanta Sharma being talked about sixth schedule, as to how the sixth schedule has been a great interest to the region. And I think if at all,
it was very interesting, very interesting.
Yeah, so the northeastern states are being talked about, and then we talk of the sixth schedule. We have to remember that this is a kind of a special provision which has been, I think Jayanta has expressed, already elaborated, that this is a special interest, special provision which has been enacted in the Constitution of India, where the particular region which was far away from the stranglehold of colonialism to continue with the same tradition and to give maximum opportunity to the people of the region to have their socio-economic development and to be able to join the mainstream. I think when you talk of the mainstream India tends to symbolize the level of development which is quite higher compared with the development process, which was very late to catch up with in the region, and where the region did require some special concessions, not really provision, special concession in order to be able to match up to the development process, which was an all India development process. I think that is where, and when in the Constituent Assembly, and then when you talk of the northeastern region, we must have to understand that the whole region had was also entitled, was also extended as some kind of a special provision by the Britishers, by the enactment of the two acts which were said, the partially excluded act and also exclusive excluded areas act. These were enacted in 1847, and there they say that because the northeastern region was primarily a hilly region and also was inaccessible because of the natural forest cover, the Britishers did not find it very beneficial to them to come up, to cross the forest and the inaccessible hilly areas to come and establish the colonial rule. And secondly, they also did not show enormous interest in the northeastern region of India, simply because there were no possibility of any cash crop which could have been planted here because of the hilly terrain, and which could have probably sustained the mercantile interests of the Britishers. So, and then why I'm saying this, because the Britishers have to be understood that wherever they went in search of, because they were primarily merchants here, and the British rule started in India with the establishment of the East India Company, which was a trading organization in the beginning. Later on, after they had colonized India economically, they went in for political, for establishment of political rule over India. But then, given the fact that it was a hilly area, there was no possibility of any cash crop being planted, and the same cash crop which could have produced here could not have been taken to UK for sustaining the industrialization and also for earning more and more profit, as they were merchants primarily. The Britishers had also not shown any interest either in occupying the area or in trying to sort of, colonizing the area in the fullest sense of the term, as they had done with the rest of the country. I think when I'm talking to you from Meghalaya, a city called Shillong, and we also know if the Britishers came to the closest to the northeastern region, that was Assam, since Assam had a kind of a very congenial climate where they had explored the possibilities, they could plant tea cultivation, and they could then reap heavy harvest. And that's how I think the tea was brought to China, from China to India, and then it was brought by the Britishers, and then the tea cultivation has taken up, and the whole tea plantation areas were that time owned by the British traders, given the fact that tea is a cash crop. So when you talk of Shillong, I think we also know that if they came, they crossed Assam, and then they came on to Meghalaya, state of Meghalaya. That time it was part of Assam. So they also came because that time Shillong had limestone and betel nuts, which could be used, which were in the nature of cash crops, which they could export to UK and try to get more and more profit out of those production. And also the other problem, and because of this, the Britishers came to Northeast India. Otherwise, the Britishers were totally nonchalant, and they had left the region to be governed by in a traditional manner by the traditional chieftains, by the traditional rulers, which I think Jayanta has shown as to how three kinds of rulers were there. And in the tribal areas, there were this traditional system of governance, which were allowed by them, and the Britishers also never invested in anything, and also did not earn much thing, except the fact that as colonial rule proceeded, they started collecting some taxes from the Dowasis, and who were asked to collect money from the villagers and try to give it, transfer it back to the British Empire. So otherwise, I think the British rule has to be understood in the context that they were traders, they primarily remained traders, and if political colonization took place later on, it was primarily to strengthen their economic control over the whole of the country, rather than to bring about any kind of governance. I think in that context, since the people of the northeastern region were used to being left to their own traditional way of living, including the governance, the northeastern Indian population were also looking forward to some kind of continuation of that kind of a provision, where they could continue with their own traditional way of living and not really come in contact with the so-called modern form of governance, which was democracy, and should be able to continue with their own traditional way of living. When you talk of traditional living, we need to understand that if the region showed signs of poverty at the time of British colonial, beginning of the British colonialism, and also at the time of India's independence, it's only because that they had not shifted to, and they had not shown an inclination to any kind of a modern way of integrating themselves with the modern economy, which could have probably contributed towards an enhanced increased per capita income for the population. But because of the fact they were traditionally inclined to their traditional way of living, the traditional way of governance, and given the fact that they had very less contact with the foreigners, the Japanese came only to fight with the Britishers, and that's how we go to Nagaland, we go to Manipur. We have long stories of as to how Indian National Army, set up by Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, came up, was set up to fight along with the Japanese, the British Army in the so-called famous wars of war. But otherwise, the contact with the foreigners for this tribal population had been very, very limited. And given the fact that the contact was limited, so it is very natural that the contact with the so-called modern economic processes would also be very, very limited. And that is how the region showed some kind of, in our own way, a kind of an island of poverty where everybody else was doing well. I think when you talk of island of poverty, the local population may not agree with this kind of island poverty, because given the way of tradition of living, and given their so-called non-awareness about the increased desire for the modern way of living, they were quite satisfied. And given the fact that they were under the traditional democratic rule, which was not democratic, but they call it traditional democracy, which was being carried on by the village chiefs, by the local Raja, as they call it. In Meghalaya, they call it CM. And each tribe had their own tribal lord, which could be in the nature of the king. The people were also had not discovered as to what the modern sense of freedom meant. I think when you talk of today, democracy, modern democracy, Western democracy, you talk of the modern sense of freedom, we understand that this freedom is totally different from what people used to know traditionally in the traditional societies of the Northeast India as to what was their freedom. So anyway, when we understand that, and given the fact that they had been used to this traditional way of governance, which is not as democratic as we will like the modern democracy called to be. So they were somehow were not very expressive about their kind of, whether it's kind of realists of the rights, or it could be about the kind of economic gains or economic development which could take place, which could have taken care of the whole population as the population was also rising. I think when you compare the population of the northeastern region today and compared with 30 years ago, it is not a kind of a geometrical kind of a rise of population, but we find that there has been a kind of a tremendous increase in the population. And that is because, as we know, that increase in population rate is a natural phenomenon, and that also gives rise to a lot of population which would look for employment. But given the fact that there are not enough employment opportunities, obviously with the forest area, they would not be getting so-called modern employment opportunity, and they had to remain confined to the traditional way of living, which was merely a hunting and a gathering society. I think, and then the cultivation, agricultural development was very limited, simply because that the hilly terrain would not allow such kind of a cultivation, and they would have to look for. Sorry, yeah, they have somebody talking about. They have to look forward to. Some kind of a limited area of cultivation, which was known as jhum cultivation. And jhum cultivation, as you know, by the nature that the forests will have to be cleared on the top of the mountains, and wherever the forests are cleared, some limited plantation will be done. And given the fact that after the plantation is ripped, and those areas used to be burnt, and then they used to move on to other areas. But then whatever agricultural production was there, it was not even enough for the whole population to be met with their demands, and they used to be forced to live in a life of, as we call it, life of poverty and life of limited happiness. Because it will not be easy to say that they were unhappy, because we have not found any kind of a revolt taking place from within their own society. So they were probably, it will be safe to say they were happy in a limited manner. But nonetheless, we need to understand that if the area is backward, if the area people may glorify the traditional way of governance, but we find that somehow this traditional form of governance tends to be incompatible with the modern form of governance if we apply the basic norms of democracy. But nonetheless, since they were used to this traditional governance, the demand was made by Reverend J.J. Nichols Roy, who made a demand in the Constituent Assembly that the sixth schedule, which is a special provision which Jayanta Sharma talked about, must be incorporated in the constitution to ensure that the tribal areas continue with their local customs, local culture, local way of life, and where the so-called modernity, whose carriers were the outsiders, the non-tribal population, they would not be allowed to come and mingle with as freely as they could. They were mingling with other parts of India. And the special provision tends to have been agreed to by the constitution makers. We also need to understand that, as we have been saying, that the elites, the advocates, the lawyers, and the other intellectuals who were leading the freedom struggle, which included Jawaharlal Nehru, which included Mahatma Gandhi, and other westernized, Western-educated intellectuals, were quite. They were familiar with the Westminster style government. They were also in a hurry to take over the power from the Britishers, because they knew, since they were in the forefront of the independence struggle, they will be the ones who will be occupying the positions of power and authority in the post-independent India. So there was a sense of hurriness amongst the elites, which constituted these westernized elites, the lawyers, the other Western-educated intellectuals, to negotiate with the Britishers for independence, rather than to consider any kind of a wholesome plan for the development of the post-independent India, if any time the Britishers leave. So there was a sense of hurriness was there, and there was also a sense of eagerness among the intellectuals to take over the power from the Britishers. And they, in the Constitutional Assembly, we find even if Indian Constitution at that point of time was still bulky, almost 398 articles were there, but we find that they did not show any eagerness to enter into a dialogue to find out as to what would be the net effects of a special constitutional measure called Sixth Schedule to rule, to control, or to govern the tribal areas of the northeastern India. Sixth Schedule tends to be comprising of 4 states, primarily Meghalaya, Mizoram, Nagaland, Tripura. So, and Assam is not under sixth schedule because although Assam, some tribal areas because of demand has that sixth schedule, but most of the Assamese tribal areas tend to be governed by the fifth schedule. Fifth schedule is another provision which is somewhat different from the sixth schedule, and it has limited power than with the sixth schedule. With the sixth schedule, the government of India, as the constitution makers, agreed to that income sixth schedule, which tends to have again created a state within a state. I think the writers on sixth schedule tends to look at the northeastern region as a separate state, then within the so-called large Indian state. So, and that is how I think the various articles were created. Although we are familiar with the Article 370, which was a special provision for the Jammu and Kashmir, but here also we have 371, 372, 373, and 374, which part of them have been abolished by a special provision to give them make them a part of the India, but to give, and which gives them some special power and provisions to these areas where they are not subject to the kind of the Government of India acts which are enacted by the Indian Parliament. I think sixth schedule is primarily damaging because the sixth schedule also they agreed to a separate set of rules which included which we say customary laws. Customary laws. Elsewhere you find that most of us have got into the modern set of modern because the modern process. Most of us have got into modern procedures of governance where we do not have any kind of a customary rules for our respective community from where we come from. But customary rules, customary laws, as we say, were part and parcel of the tribal society, and customary laws were also agreed to get a constitutional status which cannot be amended by the Union Parliament, by the Parliament of India, which could have probably been brought at par with the modern laws. I think and then customary laws as they were framed by the elderly people of older generations tend to be rather patriarchal in nature, where it seems to be not very, very respectful of the women's rights to right-based development, as we see democracy tends to promise that to be to the rest of the country. I think customary laws tends to since it is a constitutional status, it has come to become a stagnation, and I think and Indian Parliament has no right now, no power to amend that, and the customary laws are now being used as a weapon to sort of keep the women folk under the control of the male and control of the males within the society, where women seem to be having no right other than what has been agreed to under customary laws. I think customary laws are, as we know, in any traditional society, which could have happened also when Rasa was not, the modern Rasa or modern Soviet Union, where each community, given the fact that it was filled up with values of patriarchy, the males have been given more power over the matters of the society than the women. So women have been kept in a very, very subordinate position where they do not have any right, so to say, as are granted by the modern day laws and constitution, to go against the wishes of the men and also to say to go against the wishes of the society. So I think when we look at customary laws, we look at it as very, very patriarchal in nature, anti-women rights in nature, and which has also become the point of criticism by the so-called modern day feminists. But then when you look into the northeastern societies, we still find, even though women have been allowed to, in say Meghalaya, if you talk of Meghalaya, women in the northeastern India tend to be, educated more in number vis-a-vis that of the male population, given the fact that these societies tend to have at least continue the good tradition of preferring the rights of preferring the educational facilities for the women than with the men. But given the fact that so much of the percentage of women are now highly educated, the literacy rate in the northeastern states are very, very high compared to the rest of the India. I think Mizoram was one of the first state in the country which had 100% literacy. And while other states have caught up with later on, but Kerala was second. But then we find that given the fact that women have so much of educational facilities, women education is preferred than the boys' education, and women tend to have attend higher number of degrees. But we still find that women tend to, although women have been also allowed to join the workforce wherever they have expressed the desire, they can. But even then, we find that this has not got translated to the demand for any kind of a respect for women rights vis-a-vis that of the modern women. I think, and then we have found that when you look into it on the floors of the society, we can find that the women may be highly visible. They have all the rights, as has been granted to them under the customary laws, but they seem to be lagging behind in the political frame. I think when it comes to politics, northeastern states do not have that pride or their position of importance as far as the representation of women in the political process of the 8 northeastern states are concerned. I think many of the states except Assam, many of the states still do not have very many MLAs. Meghalaya, at one point of time, in the last regime of the last term of the assembly, we had 4 MLAs. This time there are only 2 MLAs. So I think, and they happen to be, and in Nagaland there happens to be no women MLA. In Arunachal Pradesh also no women MLA, and you find many of the states, other states also do not have women MLAs or women MPs who can probably work for the protection and preservation of the women's rights and also advance the women's rights. So women tend to be very much absent in the political scenario, and that also goes on to say that even the traditional society bodies, which were talked of, the village bodies, village level organizations, they also, since they were dominated by the men, women were not allowed representation or any kind of a voice to be expressed by them within the meetings of the villages, and the women have remained absent, invisible, right from the traditional local bodies up to the so-called assembly and parliament. I think Meghalaya is probably one state where, given the fact that there is a matrilineal in nature, where the children descent is traced through the mother, and the property is also, because matrilineal system demands that the property will have to be bestowed in the name of the women, women of the household. The property is passed on from the mother to the daughter, and to the youngest, and to the daughter, not to the son. It is because they believe that probably matrilineal will be protected, and the youngest girl of Khasi society will be known as the Kom Khadu. She would be the custodian of the whole family property and will look after the whole clan. So that, that is a special provision which we find in Meghalaya being a matrilineal, but we find that even if the women have property in their name, but we find that that property ownership doesn't make much of a difference to the women folk, simply because that all the decisions which are to be taken with regard to the family and the clan will have to be taken by the uncle of the house, who is a male member, rather than the women who is the owner of the property. So in any case, matrilineal is not matriarchy, simply because the women is not the head of the household. Women is simply the custodian of the property. So that way we find that this realization of the women rights in the northeastern societies tends to be even now a far-fetched dream, which is something, a cause of, if we like to say, cause of the socio-economic backwardness of the women folk in the northeastern region vis-a-vis that of the women folk in the rest of the country. I think, this is something that we find that the educated women are not sitting quiet, even if they are subject to patriarchy, they are subject to the men's control within their respective traditional societies, but there have been some kind of a noise is being made, but it has not assumed the form of a demand, which will be a political demand and which will bring about the changes in the society. So I think the changes which are coming up are a bit slow, but sometimes steady, and sometimes they are not forgotten. They are not pursued as vigorously the political process as it should be. But then nonetheless, one should take pride in the fact that some realization is coming up, and probably in the coming days, as more and more communication processes get them connected to the wider world, they would be able to probably work towards bringing about the changes in the context of the women's rights, where women would be considered to be the equal partner of men in these tribal societies, rather than remain in the background. I think that is where we need to rest our hopes on, and we are not saying that that is not going to change, but given the fact that until the Indian Constitution protects customary laws, I know it's very difficult to amend the customary laws, because once it's a sixth schedule, and schedules are not very easy to amend, they are also not subject to judicial scrutiny, because as per the constitution rules of acts of the Indian Constitution, the moment you enact this law is put in the schedule, it is beyond the judicial scrutiny, and we cannot just, and no judicial power, no judicial authority can intervene to bring about any change or pass any order for any change, even if it seems to be inhuman, even if it seems to be disrespectful, even it seems to be discriminatory, even it seems to be somewhat disruptive of the societal growth and the progress that human beings are making within the society and outside the society. I think this is where the northeastern state remains, and where the development process, which is being promoted and facilitated by the government of India with special category of funding. I think we know that during Manmohan Singh's prime ministership, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh rule, northeastern India has been given a kind of a special 10% budgetary provisions of each of the ministry of the government of India, which has to be spent every year in the northeastern region to facilitate their development. But then we find, given the fact that so much of interest is there being shown by the northeastern by the central government on the northeastern India, given the fact that so much of investment is being made by the government of India, given the fact that so many policies which are friendly policies are being made by the government of India for bringing about the social development of the northeastern region, we still find the development process is somewhat slow. I think when you talk of the new policies, we probably remember that in 1992 or 1991, after the new economic reforms were launched by Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, when Manmohan Singh was the finance minister, the Lookist policy was framed in order to not only to harness the harness the cultural links that the region had with the people of the Southeast Asia, or primarily the ASEAN countries. It was also enacted by the government of India with the hope that if the cultural contacts are harnessed, it will certainly lead to increased economic benefit by way of easy trade facilitation, where which will also lead to economic development and also lead to some kind of a industrialization or industrial development in the region. And if industrial development tends to gather pace, then probably people who are living with the poverty will not be living anymore subject to poverty. They'll be able to enjoy the prosperity as rest of the India tends to enjoy, given the limited development process that we have. But nonetheless, we find that even if the policies are enacted, even if the investment is there, but we still find that even though some development process is on, we still find that women somewhat are not equal beneficiaries of those policies as they should be, had they had a kind of a say in the development. I think when you talk of gender budgeting, when you talk of the gender issues, we find that those kind of awareness do not get reflected because of the absence of women from the decision-making plane, right from the society level, from the family level, right up to the society level and to the political level. I think, what as a students of political science, we would like to see is that I think, some kind of a awareness must have to come from within the women section, and also some kind of an encouragement will also have to come from the male section of the northeastern societies, where the policies of the government of India and the financial assistance, which is being extended by the government of India to the state governments, to the so-called autonomous district councils and other kind of councils which are there, which would lead to the real economic and social empowerment of the women folk, which has not seen the light of the day. I think that is that's the only thing that we need to work for. And I think if the men folk attitude is changed over the time, and women folk tend to show some kind of an extra courage, like the women of Russia or as well Soviet Union, I think this area would again become the land of prosperity, land of development, land of connectivity, and land of a high culture, exhibiting or welcoming more and more tourists, which is what these areas are for natural tourism. And the area will no more be known as an island of poverty, rather it will come to be known as island of prosperity. I think, although I come from outside the region, I've stayed here for about 25 years. I've lived with them, I've worked with them, but I know that the desire for the changes is very much there. But then what happens is that we need to give them a voice, and then the voice can only come when all of us as intellectuals tend to work side by side, shoulder to shoulder, with the progressive people of the northeastern region, in which includes both men and women, to bring about the necessary changes within the society to make it as modern, as developed as it should be, and to empower each individual in these tribal societies to be able to call themselves to live as a proper human being, rather than being subjugated or subordinated to the so-called traditional, within quote, feudal control of the so-called traditional elites. I think when that comes up, with the modernization process gathering speed in terms of governance, this area would no more be backward, no more be socially disempowered, as it seems to be the day. I think, if somewhere it is coming to mind that it is 98% of the territory of the Northeast is connected to international borders. One should not think, despite this 98% of the territory being connected to international border, that such solutions are not possible. But we find that given if northeastern India tends to have a very powerful, powerful neighbor like China, or there are other countries, but we still find that I think socioeconomic changes are not difficult to attain if there is willingness, if there is encouragement, and there is also some kind of a policy preparedness from the side of the political executive, which includes the government of the state, government of the center, and then the society would probably see the changes that everybody else who is development minded, who is pro women, who is pro development, who is also pro people power and not really pro feudal power, to see that the people feel really empowered and people feel really entitled to live as a self-sufficient human being, rather than being lived in a situation of dependency. I think the modern day development tends to be oriented towards removal of dependency rather than perpetuate the dependency. But we understand that this kind of traditional law which we're talking about tends to create a system of dependency, when the rest of the world is trying to unshackle itself and trying to be self-dependent, rather than being dependent on any foreign or any external power or authority, be it within the country or outside the country. I think that is where we are working on, and we look forward to with a lot of hope. When I say this, it's not that I see a situation of darkness, but I see a situation of light, where things are changing. But as I said a little while ago, that it may be slow, but it is somewhat the changes are being felt, and where we find when the days of insurgency is getting over, the traditional elites we will not be able to exercise any more sharpening, strict control on the people, and people will probably be able to usher in some kind of a revolution, as we see in the context of the Central European countries and former Soviet Union countries, where we see that orange, all kind of color revolution took place. You have orange revolution, you have a velvet revolution, which took place in Czechoslovakia, and these all happened only when the traditional control was unsettled or was withdrawn, and where people started working for their own modernity. I see that as soon as the insurgency almost gets eliminated, it's almost got eliminated, but then somewhat we find in some parts of the country there's some traditional level of some proof of insurgency is there, but that may be maybe hampering the way of modernization, modern development in terms of governance. But as insurgency gets over, as modern day development practices gets penetrated into the region would again be able to show to the rest of the country that it is no more in a situation of dependency, it is no more a begging bowl, rather it will be in a position of probably supplementing the Indian exchequer, the Indian society, by way of putting up best examples of women empowerment, socioeconomic forwardness, and also, as you say, also in terms of economic and also educational enhancement. I think with this, we should, I will stop here, but I will also, before I say anything else, I must also thank you for having taken interest on the people of the Northeastern region, and also for the simple reason that I know that Indira ma'am has been bringing students to Assam. Last time she was, I think 3-4 years back, she told us that she was coming, but unfortunately, as she used to bring the student during vacation, December 18 to January 18 is almost winter. It may be akin to the Soviet, to the Russian climate, and but then here it's a vacation, so people used to go away. And but this time, since I think Indira ma'am forgot me, but I think Professor Kandarpa Das told me that they are having international webinar, and then Professor Alexander Stolerov, whom I knew in the while I met Ma'am Indira. But then since you are doing it, and when I was going through your paper, I saw that you have set up a International Center for South Asian Studies, which is a good thing. And then I had not imagined that you will at least have a Center for South Asian Studies. I was thinking maybe the students are being brought to Mumbai and Delhi for a cultural exposure and taken back. But it's nice that you have a center where probably, I think, with your sustained interest in the South Asian affairs, and if more and more students are, I know in Russia, a lot of Russian students read Hindi. I think ma'am has many students, but then I also have read that there are other universities which are also teaching Hindi. We also have our own Russian students coming here, but then I think their cultural contacts should be enhanced, where more and more, if at all, if you talk about, as you talk about Indian, Russia, Indie, Russia, bhai. So, that I think more cultural contacts should be encouraged, and I think you should be able to come and visit the universities and also send some of your students even for short-term program. I think there are a lot of bilateral programs which can be done, but I think, somewhere as research, by staying and observing people, we learn more than what we read about it. I think that is where more and more cultural contact will probably make both these societies to be as closer as they can. We are human beings. We tend to be living in one society, and that is where I think instead of demarking ourselves, saying that, well, we are this and we are that, but I think time has come that, given the communication revolution, we are all going to be one at one point of time. Global village was a concept of Dr. McBride, but now we are probably going into a different stage where we'll be much more closer than what villages where village society considers to be. I'm very happy that your interest is there, and I did not see. I was thinking probably Indira ma'am will come someday. Probably she will come someday to Shillong, but I think she loves Assam, it seems. But then let that love be extended to the whole of the Northeast, and you bring students to sometime to Shillong, sometime to Nagaland, and sometime to Mizoram, and and I can tell you that whatever we read, the region is peaceful, the region is much more advanced, and you will probably feel at home in the Northeastern India than you feel elsewhere. Delhi, Bombay, you may feel very, very crowded. I think, and the human element is missing. I'll be going to Mumbai next month, but we all know that these are bigger cities. You can see the capitals, you can meet the political leaders, but I think the real education is always done in the peaceful and remote areas. I think that's where we can understand each other. And I hope, ma'am, you develop a contact with all of us. And I do not see you on WhatsApp anymore. You are probably, I don't know. आप तो आजकल I don't read about you. But it's nice to see you. I thought you will have some communication contact. You can also develop a mailing list where we can develop a network of South Asian studies between the Russian students and Indian students, and we can also have such kind of a interface dialogue over the net, which is cost effective and which is also culturally enriching. आप कभी शिलोंग आइए तो मैडम फिर आपको अच्छा लगेगा.
धन्यवाद.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you.